Welcome to another session of Understanding Human Anatomy. And in this series of videos, I want to describe the vascular supply to the upper extremity, beginning with the arteries and tracing the arteries and their major branches. Then we'll talk about the venous drainage to the upper extremity, and in that we will need to add some superficial veins to go along with the deep veins. The deep veins parallel the arteries, so if there's an artery, there's a vein next to it. So if you know the arteries, you know those veins. You just have to add in the superficial veins to complete the picture. And finally, the last session will talk about collateral circulation. You may or may not need to know collateral circulation for your profession or your course requirements. So that's why I left it at the end to allow individuals to skip it should they not need to know that detail. I'm going to begin with the subclavian artery. And the subclavian artery begins in the thorax. The right subclavian artery branches from the brachiocephalic artery. The left subclavian artery branches directly from the arch of the aorta. And the subclavian artery runs kind of up and around like so. And it exits the thorax and crosses the first rib, and then it becomes the axillary artery. And the axillary artery then passes into the arm, crossing the inferior border of teres major, and then it becomes the brachial artery. So let me add some labels. First, we have the subclavian artery. And the name means literally under the clavicle. Sub is under, clavian refers to clavicle. The subclavian artery. And draw a line to it here. And I said that the subclavian becomes the axillary at the first rib. Now, I don't have skeletal elements drawn in here, so we'll just use this line I've just drawn as an indicator of the first rib. And as it crosses the first rib, it becomes the axillary artery, the artery of the axilla. the axillary artery. And then the axillary artery crosses the inferior border of teres major. And again, I don't have the muscles in here. We're doing this just a very schematic diagram. So I'll put another line in here to indicate teres major. So this would indicate the inferior border of teres major. Then the artery becomes the brachial artery. And I will put a line in here for that. So you can see this is one continuous artery: subclavian, axillary, brachial. The name changes at specific boundaries. Now, the brachial artery ends by dividing into two. That's sometimes referred to as bifurcating. And it divides into a lateral artery and a medial artery. The lateral artery is the radial artery. And the medial artery is the ulnar artery. And we'll get the line into there. Now, these two arteries interconnect distally via what are known as arches. there is a deep arch, and there is a superficial arch. Now obviously those are separated going into and out of the plane of the diagram. I've separated them vertically because I can't draw the 3D on this diagram. So these are the palmar arches. Superficial and deep. Okay, the palmar arches then each give off branches that will eventually go to the digits. And then the branch is going to, each set of digits merge together to form a common artery, and then these arteries in turn will divide into digital arteries going to the digits themselves. So we have the digital arteries. So that's the basic plan. We start with subclavian, flow from subclavian to axillary, axillary to brachial. We get to the end of the brachial, we either go to the radial or to the ulnar. The radial and ulnar connect down here at the superficial and deep arches, and then the arches give off branches that eventually go to the digits. Now, what I'm going to do is take this diagram, remove the labels from it, and move it over here to the left side of the screen. And then we're going to talk about the branches of each of these large arteries, and what I'm going to do is draw the segment of the large artery on the right side and fill the branches in and label them. So if you hold on a minute, I'll make that change in the diagram. We will start with the subclavian artery. Recall that the right subclavian artery is a branch of the brachiocephalic artery. The left subclavian artery branches directly from the arch of the aorta. Now, what I'm going to do is sketch in the subclavian artery. Like so, and then we'll fill it in to make it nice and visible. So this is the subclavian artery. Now, the first branch that I want to talk about is one that comes off the superior surface of the subclavian artery and ascends through the neck. This is the artery that ascends through the transverse foramina. Let me put it over here on the other diagram, small diagram. This is the vertebral artery. The vertebral artery. And this artery passes into the neck, goes all the way back to the vertebral column, and then it's the artery that ascends through the foramina in the transverse processes of the cervical vertebra. And the vertebral artery goes up into the cranial vault through the foramen magnum and is half the blood supply to the brain. The two vertebral arteries, left and right, provide half the blood supply to the brain. Now, the second artery coming off is going to come off the inferior surface of subclavian. I'm drawing in right now, and we'll put it in on the other diagram. This artery is the internal thoracic artery. The older name for it was the internal mammary artery. The internal thoracic artery passes on the inner surface of the thoracic wall, so deep to the ribs. It helps supply the ribs, and it gives branches into the mammary gland, so the internal thoracic artery is the primary artery supplying the mammary gland. Now, the next artery I want to draw here is the thyrocervical trunk. Let me put it in on the small diagram. And this is an important artery because it supplies part of the neck, but it also, one of its branches is the inferior thyroidal artery, and it is half the blood supply to the thyroid gland on each side of the body. And the thyroid gland is an endocrine gland that helps control our metabolism, and it has an extremely rich vascular supply, and in fact needs a very rich vascular supply. So this provides half the vascular supply to the thyroid gland. And whenever you see a term trunk, it could be replaced by artery. Trunk is a term that's used to indicate that a artery is going to be relatively short and branch into two or more branches almost immediately, looking a little bit like an octopus. Okay, the last artery off of the subclavian is off the distal part of the subclavian artery. I'm drawing it in here. And this is the dorsal scapular artery. And I'll put it in over here. The dorsal scapular artery. And this artery passes into the back region, and it runs along the medial border of the scapula. And as it does so, it will provide vascular supply to the supraspinatus and infraspinatus muscles. So, and as I said, when the subclavian artery passes over the first rib, it becomes the axillary artery. And I'm going to put a line over here on the overall diagram on the left side, just to indicate where that dividing line is. So, that concludes the branches of the subclavian artery. In the next video, we'll pick up with the axillary artery. Thank you for your attention.